What if Stannis won the War of the Five Kings, but faced a dual dragon invasion? While Stannis fortifies the wall, Westeros splits into 3 crowns behind his back. Daenerys in the Vale, a second Targaryen claimant in King's Landing, and a king who's already stopped caring who sits the Iron Throne. Not a war of 5 kings anymore. A war he has to give away to win. Let's get into it. The pigeon pie had been cut, and the doves burst up into the rafters in a clatter of gray wings, and the whole hall roared its delight as the wine went round for the last toasts of the night. 77 courses. Half the great houses of the Reach were drunk beneath one roof, and at the center of it stood King Joffrey Baratheon, flushed and glowing, a boy who had finally been given a day that belonged entirely to him. A gold cloak stood 3 paces from the high table, where the hand had ordered the watch doubled. He was not a clever man. He was only a watchful one. And so his eye caught the thing that the lords and ladies deep in their cups did not. The old woman's hand drifting across the king's goblet, slow and easy, moving the way a hand moves when it wants very badly to look like it is doing nothing at all. He seized her wrist before he let himself understand whose it was. Olenna Tyrell did not cry out. She turned her head and regarded him with the mild, bottomless patience of a woman who had outlived 3 kings. And for half a heartbeat, he nearly let go, nearly bowed, nearly begged her pardon, nearly convinced himself he had imagined the whole thing. Then he turned her hand over in the candlelight, palm up, in front of the entire high table. Pressed into the lined flesh was a small vial, its stopper already worked loose. The silence did not fall all at once. It fell in pieces, table by table, as the ones nearest understood and went still. And the stillness spread outward across the hall like cold moving over a pond. Joffrey looked at the vial. He looked at the old woman, and the thing in his face that had been laughing a moment before soured into something small and vicious. "Grandmother," Marjorie breathed, and it was not a question, and it was the worst sound in the room. "Seize her!" Joffrey's voice climbed into the thin, cracking register it always found when he was frightened and would not say so. "She meant to poison me. Your king. On my own wedding day, seize her now. Down the table, Tywin Lannister was already rising, already reaching for the room with the flat authority that had ruled the realm for 20 years. Your Grace, this is a matter for... I don't care what it's a matter for. Joffrey's hand had found his knife. I want it done here, where they can all watch. Mace Tyrell came half out of his seat, the color draining from his face. A wet, formless sound starting in his throat that never made it to a word. Because Loras's hand clamped down on his father's forearm and pinned it to the table. Loras did not look at his father. He looked at his grandmother. And Olenna, who understood everything faster than anyone alive, gave the smallest shake of her head. Not now. Not you. Not like this. Tywin tried once more, low and hard, the voice he used when he meant to be obeyed without ever raising it. Kill her now, and you kill an alliance worth 10,000 men. Give her to me. Let me open her up, slowly and quietly, and learn who else was in it. I don't want her to open slowly. Joffrey was smiling now, the loose, wet smile of a frightened boy who had discovered he could make the fear go somewhere else. I want her dead in front of all of them. Let the Reach watch what happens to traitors. Cersei's hand found her son's sleeve. Even she could feel the floor tilting. But Joffrey shook her off, the way he shook off everyone who tried to make him smaller. And the moment slid past the last point where anyone could have caught it. 2 of the King's Guard took the old woman by the arms. She let them. She was far too proud to be dragged. Well, she said, to the hall, to no one. Her voice dry as the last leaf of autumn. I did tell Mace this marriage would be the death of someone. They did it there, on the floor, in the space where the trestle tables had been shoved aside. No cell, no trial, no block, because the king had said here, and the king had said now. And no man in that room was brave enough to be the one who told him he could not. A sword. It was quick, at least. That much the years had earned her. Olenna Tyrell died in the middle of her own granddaughter's wedding feast. And in the true silence that followed, the one no music rose to cover, every Tyrell bannerman beneath that roof did the same sum at the same instant. They had knelt to Lannister gold because the old woman had told them to, because the alliance kept the Reach fat and near the throne. That alliance was cooling on the flagstones now, in a dark, spreading pool no servant dared approach. The only question left in any of their minds was how quickly the rose could make the lion feel it. The feast did not resume. It could not. The guests were shown out into the night in twos and threes, silk-clad and silent, and the Reach lords among them said nothing at all to their Lannister hosts, which was itself the loudest thing they could have said. Tywin found the king in his chambers an hour later. "Do you have the faintest idea," Tywin said, without greeting, without preamble, "what you have cost this crown tonight? I executed a traitor." Joffrey was still holding his wine, still riding the high, thin edge of it. "She tried to murder me. What would you have had me do? Thank her? I would have had you take her quietly, question her quietly, and keep her alive." Tywin's voice never rose. That was the terror of it. A living hostage is worth an army. A corpse on your wedding floor is worth exactly nothing, except to the men whose grandmother you just butchered in front of them. They're sworn to us. They were sworn to her. Tywin set his cup down with a click that was louder than any shout. "Your grandfather Aerys thought a crown made him untouchable. I watched what that cost. You will learn the same lesson, boy, and I fear you will learn it the same way." Joffrey's smile faltered. He was not clever, but he was clever enough to hear a threat that had no edges to grip. "You have never once understood the difference between fear and loyalty," Tywin said at the door. "Pray it does not undo you before you're old enough to." The damage was already loose in the world and moving faster than any of them. Even as Tywin descended the stairs, Mace Tyrell's riders were changing horses at the first way station south of the city, carrying sealed orders that no longer needed his mother's hand to feel iron. Withdraw. Quietly, in good order, at once. And Marjorie, still and technically Joffrey's queen, sat awake in her chambers understanding that the crown on her brow had become the lid of a box. Mace Tyrell had spent his whole life being carefully, comfortably indecisive. Grief did to him what ambition never had. He gathered his sons and his most trusted men in a shuttered room, and for the first time anyone could remember, he did not ask what his mother would have wanted, because he already knew, and because she was not there to soften it into something gentler. "They killed her like a dog," Garland said quietly, "in front of us, and we sat there. We sat there because sitting there was the only way any of us left that city alive." Mace's hands were shaking, but his voice, for once, was not. "Marjorie is still inside those walls. Remember that. Before you draw a sword, none of us can afford to draw yet." "Then we find someone who can afford it." Loras had not slept. It showed in the flatness of him. "We need a sword with a grievance as old as ours, and an army still on its feet." "There's only one man in Westeros who fits. Stannis." Mace said the name like a man testing his weight on river ice. Dragonstone, the battle-hardened remnant of Blackwater, beaten but not broken, and a lord who had never in his life forgiven anyone anything. Draft it carefully. He won't answer warmth. He'll answer terms and nothing else. Across the black water, on his island of rock and salt and old stone, Stannis Baratheon read the letter twice by the light of Melisandre's fires. He did not smile. He had perhaps 3 smiles left in him, and none of them were spent on paper. But the muscle in his jaw worked the way it did when the numbers moved in his favor. The Lannisters had lost the reach. A drunk boy on a stolen throne had done in one evening what Stannis' whole war had failed to do. Davos watched him from across the table and said the obvious thing, because someone had to. It's a trap as easily as an opening. They mislike us as much as they mislike him. The moment we've broken the Lannisters for them, they may find they've no more use for us either. They may. Stannis folded the letter along its crease, exactly the way he did everything. It changes nothing. The boy sits on a throne that is mine by every law of gods and men. If the Reach hands me the swords to take it, I do not much care why they hand them over. Melisandre said nothing at all. She was watching the fire, and the fire, lately, had stopped showing her thrones. Davos, Stannis rose. Bring me my banners. Mace's envoys came to Dragonstone, expecting to be received with the wary courtesy of a man who needed them. Instead, they were met by a lord who stated his price before they had finished their bows. Your levies march under my command, not beside it, Stannis said. Your house supports my claim before gods and men, not a claim I share. In return, you have my army and my justice, and I will take your Marjorie out of that viper's nest myself, before the Lannisters think of holding her as a shield. Those are my terms. I do not haggle. I have neither the patience nor the talent for it. The envoys glanced at one another. It was not warm. It was not gracious. It was, they realized, with something close to relief, entirely trustworthy. A man this rigid could not flatter you and would not lie to you either. And when the war is won, the elder ventured, and you sit the throne, the Reach would ask to know its place in the new order. Your place is what it has always been, first among the great houses, wardens of the South, so long as you keep faith. Stannis did not soften it. Break it, and you will find I keep no better feelings for a rose than for a lion. I judge men by what they do, not by whose banner they were born under. It was the least reassuring reassurance any of them had ever heard, and somehow the most convincing. Lord Loras asks the honor of the extraction himself, the elder said. Stannis considered it a moment. Grief makes men careless. See that his does not cost his sister her life. It did not. Loras Tyrell had folded his fury into something cold and exact, and he used it. The extraction was dressed as a diplomatic courtesy. A small Tyrell party granted leave to visit the Queen and collect what remained of the late Lady Olenna's effects, a thing so undignified and mournful that no one thought to look twice. They had Marjorie in a plain gray traveling cloak and halfway to the mud gate before it went wrong. A gold cloak captain, sharper than the rest, counted the party going out and made it one larger than the party that had come in. He called the halt. He drew his blade. "Nobody leaves the Queen's household without the Queen's leave," he said, and put out a hand for the gray-cloaked figure at the center of the group. For a moment, one long, ugly moment in the torch smoke under the gate, it hung entirely in the balance. 3 Tyrell guards against a dozen of the watch. Marjorie pressed flat to the cold stone, with a stranger's arm barred across her chest, her breath loud in her own ears. One of the household men went down at once with a spear in his belly, and a little plan came apart into simple butchery in the space of 3 heartbeats. Loris took a blade across the ribs, turning the thrust meant for his sister's throat. He felt it go in shallow and drag. He did not fall. He put his own steel up through the captain's eye, wrenched it free, and hissed "go" through his teeth, with blood already sheeting warm down his side. The survivors ran, hauling Marjorie between them, out of the torchlight and into the black warren of Flea Bottom. And they did not stop running until the gate was a memory, and the shouting behind them had lost their trail in the maze. By the time Cersei was told her son's queen had vanished, the Tyrell columns were already a full day's ride from the Crown Lands, their banners struck, their host wheeling south and west to join a larger one, and any last pretense that the rose still served the lion had gone south with them. Within a fortnight, the 2 hosts became one. Stannis' disciplined, scarred veterans and the fresh, furious, fully mustered strength of the Reach folded together into a single force, larger and colder and better ordered than anything House Lannister could put in a field alone. The fiery heart of the Red God and the golden rose of Highgarden advanced side by side down the King's Road, and in the Tower of the Hand, Tywin Lannister stood a long while at his window, doing sums that would not come right, no matter how he worked them. For the first time since Robert Baratheon had smashed the Targaryens on the Trident, Tywin Lannister understood that his house was in a war it might actually lose. The window gave him no comfort, so Tywin turned from it and began to write. He wrote to House Frey, who owed the crown nothing and loved it less, and reminded them, in careful phrases, of debts and of futures. He wrote to the river lords, still nominally sworn, calling in every threat and every obligation he had left. He wrote to the Westerlands to squeeze one more levy from mines that were already running dry of men. And the answers, when they came, were thinner than he needed, and grew thinner still, because word travels ahead of an army, and the word running ahead of this one was that Stannis Baratheon won every field he entered. Walder Frey, ever a practical man of coin and grudge, had no wish to bleed for a lion the whole realm could see was dying. His reply was full of apologies and empty of men. The river lords who answered at all answered the same way, with regrets, with excuses, with the careful, weasel-worded loyalty of men measuring which way the wind had turned. It had turned. They all knew it. They wrote to say so in the politest possible terms. Every day the numbers on Tywin's maps grew worse, and every day he moved the same handful of pieces across them, looking for the arrangement that would make them come right. There was no such arrangement. He had built his whole life on the certainty that a Lannister always pays his debts, and now the ledger had turned over, and it was full of names he had wronged, and every one of them was riding this way, behind Stannis Baratheon's banners. Jaime Lannister found his father among the maps at the darkest hour of the night. "You should send Cersei and Tommen west," Jaime said. "Tonight, before the roads close. Casterly Rock will hold." "Casterly Rock isn't the problem, father. The city is." Jaime looked at the map the way a man looks at a wound he already knows is mortal. He had spent months in the ruin of the countryside with a woman who kept telling him uncomfortable truths, and something in him had gone quiet and honest since. "We don't have the walls for a host this size. We don't have men. We have wildfire, and we have Cersei's certainty that wildfire is enough. And one of those things is going to burn this city to the ground, trying to prove the other. Then hold it anyway." Tywin did not look up. A Lannister does not open his own gates. "No," Jaime said. "We just wait for someone else to." Cersei had her own answer, and it was the one Jaime feared most. He found her later, with a cup in her hand, and that bright, brittle certainty in her eyes, and when he spoke the word wildfire, she only smiled. "Let Stannis come," she said. "Let him break his army on these walls the way Robert never could. Aerys had the right to it, about one thing at least. Burn them all, and let them choke on the ash." Aerys died screaming on his own throne room floor, Cersei. "Our father's man put a sword on his back. That's how that story ends." Jaime kept his voice low. He was, at that moment, the only person in the Red Keep telling anyone the truth. "You'll kill half the city and change nothing. Send Tommen away. Please. Whatever else is true, he doesn't have to be here when it comes down." She did not send Tommen away. She never once in her whole life learned how to let go of a thing she was holding. He knew how it ended. That was the private curse of it. Jaime could see the whole shape of the thing, while his sister still believed stubbornness and green fire could bend arithmetic. He walked the walls that night and counted the defenders and counted them again and got the same wrong answer both times. Stannis's combined host reached the walls of King's Landing as the first true cold of the year came down off the Blackwater, and the siege began. The siege, the war, had never once given him the numbers to properly close. No Tyrell army raced to the Lion's rescue this time, because the Tyrell army was the one at the gates. No wildfire fleet waiting in the bay, because Stannis had learned that water the hard way and did not mean to learn it twice. The defenders held the walls for 3 days on courage and habit. On the 4th, watching the siege towers crawl forward under a discipline no drunken king had ever instilled in anyone, they stopped asking whether the city would fall. They began, quietly, to ask only how much of it would still be standing when the gates gave way. The gates gave way at dawn on the 6th day, and the answer to the question was less than anyone had hoped. The fighting went street by street, and it cost. Stannis did not let his men loose to sack. He flogged 2 of them in sight of the army for looting a sept on the first morning to make the point unmissable. But a city taken by storm bleeds, regardless of any lord's intention, and King's Landing bled. His vanguard was thrown back twice from the hook by a knot of Lannister guardsmen who had decided to die where they stood, and for an hour the assault stalled entirely in the narrow streets, men dying on both sides for 40 yards of cobblestone. Then the weight of numbers told, as it always tells, and the tide went one way and did not come back. Stannis came through the broken Red Keep not like a man claiming a throne he had dreamed of for years, but like a magistrate arriving late to a sentence long overdue. Grim, unhurried, procedural. Cersei was found in the throne room with Tommen's small hand clutched in hers, and she was taken alive, still telling everyone within reach exactly who she was. Jaime laid his sword on the steps of the Iron Throne rather than spend the last of his men on a cause already lost, and Stannis accepted it with a single nod, one soldier acknowledging another's arithmetic. He held court within days. There was no theater in it, none of the cruelty Joffrey had brought to such things, none of the spectacle. Stannis read the charges himself in a flat, carrying voice and let the deeds speak. Joffrey, for regicide by intent and for tyranny. Cersei, for treason and for the lie that had put a bastard on the throne. Gregor Clegane, for the murder of Elia Martell and her children in the sack of the city long ago. Jaime, Kingslayer, Oathbreaker, condemned by the letter of a law Stannis would not bend, even for a man who had surrendered honorably. They died without ceremony, which was the only mercy a legalist knew how to give. Tywin Lannister was not there to see it. He had slipped west to rally a last defense at Casterly Rock, and it took weeks and a great many lives to dig him out of it. But the rock fell, as everything was falling now, and the old lion met the same clean sentence in the end, doing sums to the last that would not come right. Kevin Lannister, who had never wanted this war, and who counseled surrender the very hour word of his brother's death reached him, was spared. So was Tommen, a child guilty of nothing but the circumstances of his birth, taken not to a block, but into wardship, to be raised by the new order rather than ended by it. Even Stannis' iron could tell the difference between justice and the murder of children. Barely, but it could. And then, with the South his and the law satisfied, Stannis Baratheon did a thing that was equal parts justice and cold statecraft. He had the heads of Tywin Lannister and Gregor Clegane packed in salt and sent south down the King's Road to Sunspear, a formal, unmistakable acknowledgement of a debt 3 decades old, the murder of Elia Martell, Dorne's wound that had never once closed. In the shaded coolness of the old palace, Prince Doran Martell received the grim gift and turned the words of Stannis' envoy over slowly, his gouty hands folded on the arm of his chair, his face giving away exactly nothing. He thanked them with a courtesy so measured it could have meant anything. He said all the correct things about justice long delayed and balances at last restored. He did not say one word about his brother Oberyn, about where Oberyn had been these long months, or whom he had gone to meet across the narrow sea, or the boy with silver hair and a claim older than Stannis' own, whom Dorne had already, quietly, decided to back. He let the envoys ride north, believing the debt was settled and the matter closed. It was not settled. It was not anywhere near closed. And 1,000 leagues to the east, on a different shore entirely, a young woman the whole of Westeros had already forgotten was raising an army of her own beneath 3 living dragons. And neither she, nor Doran, nor the silver-haired boy in Oberyn's care had yet learned that the throne they were all reaching for had, in their absence, already changed hands. The East could wait. It would not wait long. And the man who had just won the 7 kingdoms did not yet know there was anything out there to wait for. What Stannis Baratheon knew in the first weeks of his reign was debts. He held court in the Red Keep the way a magistrate holds an assize. No revels, no largesse, no grateful lords raised up for the price of a smile. The realm had been misgoverned for a generation, and he meant to correct the ledger, line by line. and the first line was the twins. House Frey had made an art of the broken guest rite and the profitable betrayal. Stannis found the art distasteful and the artists worse. He did not massacre them. He was not Joffrey, and slaughter on a hall floor was the precise thing he'd spent a war ending. But he stripped old Walder of his lordship, took his head under lawful sentence for crimes the man's own boasting had recorded, and scattered the surviving Freys to the cold mercy of the houses they had wronged. Riverrun he gave back. The Blackfish came to the throne room, stiff from the saddle, and stiffer from suspicion, and stood before the man who'd handed his family its castle, as though waiting to be told the cost. "There is no cost," Stannis said, reading the look. "Your grandnephew was murdered under a peace banner. The men who did it prospered. Now they don't. That is not a gift, sir. It is arithmetic." Brynden Tully studied him for a long moment. "I've served a good many kings. You're the first who made justice sound like a chore." "It is a chore." Stannis had already turned to the next petition. Most necessary things are. The Riverlands came to him for it, freely, which was the part his enemies never grasped. He bought no love, and somehow the not buying was worth more than any charm a Lannister ever spent. Men learned to trust a blade that cut the same way every time. But through all of it, at his shoulder, Melisandre had stopped watching thrones. She sat before the braziers each night and read flames that no longer showed a king the things a red priestess was supposed to bring him. No crowns, no usurpers, no victories left to promise. What the fire gave her now was cold, a wall of ice, and behind it, a darkness older than the wall, older than the Andals, older than the first men who'd raised the stones. A war that did not care in the smallest degree who currently sat which chair in the south. "It is coming, my king," she told him. "The long night. Everything I followed you toward was only ever the road to this." He did not doubt her. That was the trouble. He had watched a shadow wearing his brother's face put a knife through Renly's heart. He had seen the leeches and the burning man and the blood of kings, and he had learned, against every grain of his skeptic's nature, that when this woman named a thing real, it was. His counsel had not had the benefit of that education. They pressed him hard those days to do the only sane thing a conqueror could: sit the chair he'd bled for, bind a realm still bleeding, be seen. A crown left the moment it was won was a crown asking to be taken. "The realm needs its king," Davos said. Davos said it because he believed it, not because he wanted anything, which was why Stannis let him finish. "The realm needs to be alive to need a king." Stannis rose from the black chair. "I have won a seat. I will not warm it while the thing that ends all seats walks south unwatched, because not one lord in this room can make himself believe in the cold until it's in his own hall. Muster the host, the greater part of it. We march north. They argued. He allowed the arguing. Then he did precisely what he'd said. That was the whole tragedy of him, and the whole worth of him. He had never once let the easier war talk him out of the truer one. The South closed behind his column like water behind a keel, and 1,000 miles beyond anyone who might have stopped it, a fleet with dragons aboard was already cutting toward the coast. In Sunspear, the heads had already been drawn from their salt, looked upon, and put away, and Prince Doran had said all the correct and careful things, and sent the northern envoys home, believing the account was closed. It was not closed. Oberyn saw to that within the hour of their leaving. He found his brother in the shade of the water gardens, where the children of Dorne shrieked through the fountains, and Doran sat swaddled against a chill only his gout could feel. You thanked Baratheon for our sister's justice. Oberyn was smiling. He was always smiling. It was the most dangerous thing about him. Prettily done, brother, and entirely beside the point. Sit, Oberyn. I'd rather crouch. He dropped to his heels by the chair, close, his voice sliding beneath the noise of the water. Elia's justice is the mountain's head in a box, and I'll take it. Gods know I've waited long enough. But I have something better than a head. I have her son. Doran did not move. Only his hands, folded on the chair arm, went slowly still. Aegon died in the sack, he said. The mountain dashed his skull against a wall. We buried what was left of him beside his mother. You buried a butcher's boy of the right age and the right hair. Oberyn's smile had teeth in it now. Varys is a great many things, most of them serpents. But he got the true prince out, over the narrow sea, into the keeping of John Connington, raised these 20 years by a company of exiles and a dead man's grief. Rhaegar's son, Elia's son, grown now and trained and ready. And every day you play your patient little game of decades, brother. He waits for Dorne to say the word. For a long while there was only the water and the shrieking of children who would never know what was being decided over their heads. Doran Martell had spent his life being underestimated by louder men, and he had never resented it, because being underestimated was the whole of his power. He turned the thing over the way he turned everything over, slowly, from every side, feeling for the flaw. Gratitude to Stannis was real. Justice for Elia, delivered by another man's hand, was real, but a Baratheon on the throne gave Dorne a corpse's satisfaction, and nothing more than that.
A boy with Martell blood on the Iron Throne itself gave Dorne the thing it had wanted since before Oberyn learned to hold a spear. "You've kept this from me for years," Doran said. It was not quite an accusation. "From your own brother, from your prince." "I kept it from a man who might have felt honor-bound to be careful with it." Oberyn crouched again, level with him. "You've been careful for 20 years, Doran. Careful got Elia raped and murdered while the realm looked the other way. Careful got her children's skulls handed to Robert Baratheon wrapped in a Lannister cloak. I love you, brother. I have run out of patience for careful." Doran looked at his brother's face, so like their sisters, and for once did not have a longer game ready to reach for. "Stannis has taken his whole strength north," he said at last, and it was not a question. His own spies had told him days ago. The South is a house with its doors standing open. The South is a rose garden with no garden.
Oberyn stood, unfolding like something uncoiling. "Tell me to send the raven, Doran. That's all it costs you. One word, and Dorne stops avenging the past and starts writing the future." Doran closed his eyes. Somewhere in the fountains, a child laughed. And it might have been Elia, 50 years gone. "Send it," he said. The word crossed the water. Across the sea, in a war camp of golden skulls and hard men who'd sold their swords to a dead cause and found it living. A young man with silver hair and his mother's dark eyes was told that Westeros had left its gate unbarred. John Connington gripped the boy's shoulder like a father who had waited his whole ruined life for one clean thing. And Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name in all but the crown, boarded ship, sailing toward a realm that believed its long dragon nightmare had ended with Robert's hammer decades ago, and had no idea at all that its king was riding hard in the opposite direction. The column marched north into a country that got harder with every league, and the ravens came down to it the whole way. They came from Castle Black, in a hand Stannis had learned to recognize, the plain, hard-pressed script of Jon Snow, Lord Commander of a watch worn to almost nothing. Wildlings massing beyond the wall in numbers no living man remembered. Villages in the haunted forest have gone silent and empty. And, threaded through the practical reports, in language a careful man used when he feared being thought mad, worse things. Cold that killed birds on the wing, rangers who did not come back, and then came back wrong. Lesser lords would have read it and thought the boy was frightened of shadows. Stannis read it and thought the boy was the only honest man on the whole wall. "He doesn't exaggerate," Stannis said, folding the latest into his glove. "That is what makes him useful. Half the realm cries wolf to be spared a chore. This one buries the fear 3 lines deep in hopes you won't notice it's there. He believes what he's seeing. So do I. Davos, riding close, ventured the thing the council would have said out loud. A great many men north of the neck believe a great many things, your grace. Grumkins and snarks, cold gods in the snow. If we spend the realm's last army chasing a Lord Commander's nightmares, then we will have spent it on the one nightmare that turned out to be true. Stannis did not raise his voice. I have watched men laugh at this exact warning, Davos. Every one of them is dead now, or soon will be. I would rather be the fool who marched north for nothing than the wise man who stayed south for a throne and let the world freeze behind his back. Davos said no more. He had followed this king out of worse certainties than this one. Melisandre rode at Stannis' other side through the sleet, and she was watching the campfires each night with a face that gave Davos bad dreams. You see the cold ahead, she told the king, low so the column would not hear. Good. But I see behind us too, my king, and it is not empty. Dragons in the east, a griffin's banner in the south. The board you rose from is not finished playing, whatever you have decided about it. I have not decided the board is finished. Stannis did not slow his horse. I have decided which piece kills everyone if it's ignored. A dragon can burn a city. So can I, given wildfire and spite. The thing north of the wall does not want a city. It wants the world to stop being warm. He looked at her once, sidelong. If I am wrong, I lose the throne. If I am right, and I stay south to keep it, I lose everything. And so does every man who would have crowned me. That is not a hard sum, my lady. It only looks hard to men who want it to. She said nothing more. The fire had shown her he would not turn, and she had followed him a long way on the strength of fires that told her less. The host reached Castle Black in the first hard week of true winter, and the night's watch came out onto the ice-slick yard to see it, and did not quite believe what they were seeing. A king with an army came for them. Jon Snow gripped Stannis' forearm like a drowning man reaching a spar, too proud to say what it meant, and too honest to hide it. They set to work within the day, dragonglass into every armory, disciplined companies onto every mile of the wall the watch had been too few to hold. Order laid over exhaustion. For the first time in a generation, the wall had enough men. It lasted exactly until the raven came up from the south. A maester's hand this time, hurried, the seal cracked in haste. Stannis read it, standing on the frozen yard, with the wind taking the smoke sideways, and Davos watched the color of the day change in his king's face. Not fear. Stannis did not do fear, but the specific stillness of a man watching a sum he'd hoped to be wrong about come out exactly as feared. A fleet had made landfall in the Vale of Arryn. Foreign, vast, and flying unmistakably the black and red banner of House Targaryen. It had not come ashore in the Crown Lands, where a queen hungry for a throne might be expected to land. It had come ashore in the Vale, and that choice her advisers had won her to over long nights of argument was the first sign to anyone watching that Daenerys Targaryen intended to conquer Westeros like a woman who meant to keep it, rather than burn it. The Vale was a fortress the size of a kingdom, ringed in mountains, fat and untouched by 6 years of war that had gutted everywhere else. Barristan Selmy had put it plainly. Take a smoking capital, and you inherit ash. Take the Vale, and you inherit an army, a granary, and walls no one has bled against. So the Unsullied came ashore in their silent thousands, and the Dothraki spilled out, screaming, into green hills that had never seen a horse lord. And above it all, 3 dragons carved slow circles against a clear autumn sky. The knights of the Vale had spent years sealed away under Lysa Arryn's madness, and Peter Baelish's quiet stewardship, untouched, unblooded, and utterly without any framework for what fell on them out of that clear sky. Lords who had argued for a decade about tourneys looked up at Drogon's shadow crossing the Eyrie and understood in their stomachs that the age they'd been hiding inside had ended. Peter Baelish understood it fastest of all, and did what he always did. He went to meet the new power with a bow and an offer. He came to Daenerys's court, all warmth and deference. Robin Arryn's small, pale authority tucked in his sleeve like a card, and he laid the veil at her feet as if it were his to lay, its knights, its gold, its willing loyalty, asking in exchange only what he ever asked: a place near the top, a whisper in the right ear. The same game he'd played against every rival in Westeros for 20 years, turned now on a foreign queen who had dragons where her domestic betters had merely armies. He was very good. He was perhaps the best there had ever been. He simply did not know that someone had reached the Queen's people first. Sansa Stark had spent years as this man's pupil, watching precisely how the trick was done, the flattery, the offered secret, the debt engineered and then forgiven at interest. She had learned it well enough to know its one weakness. It only worked on people who did not already hold the ledger. So she brought the ledger. Quietly, before Littlefinger ever made his bow, she went to Barristan and to Missandei with the whole of it. Her Aunt Lysa pushed screaming through the moon door, by the very hand now offering the Queen its loyalty. The letters, the poisonings, the long, patient history of a man who had never once been on any side but his own. She did not do it for the Dragon Queen. She did it because she had learned in a hard school that the only way to survive a man like Petyr Baelish was to move against him before he decided he was finished with you. She had watched him teach that lesson himself, and she had been an apt student. When Petyr Baelish returned to court, expecting to be raised up, he found the Unsullied already at the doors. He was clever to the last. He wept, he reasoned, he offered Daenerys 3 different futures in the space of a minute, each one a doorway with a knife behind it. Daenerys Targaryen had been sold, threatened, married off, and lied to since she was a girl, and she had developed a very fine ear for the particular music of a man selling her something. She let him finish. Then Grey Worm's spear took him where he stood. "The girl gave us the truth about you," Daenerys told the body, "before you could sell me the lie. Remember that, if there's any remembering where you're going. It was a Stark that undid you in the end." Sansa Stark walked out of that hall, having spent nothing and bought everything. Her own safety, and with it the full, freely given loyalty of the Knights of the Vale, sworn now to a Targaryen banner. And far to the south, unaware of any of it, another dragon's fleet was already dropping anchor in a bay Stannis Baratheon had left almost undefended. Kevan Lannister stood on the walls of King's Landing and counted the sails coming into the bay. And he was a soldier long enough to have finished the arithmetic before the first of them touched the shore. Stannis had left him this city as a kindness of sorts, a spared man given a purpose, command of the small garrison that kept the peace in a capital that had already surrendered once and had no fight left in it. It was a watchman's force. It was never meant to be a wall against an invasion, because no one who mattered had believed an invasion was coming. Kevan looked at the golden skulls on the banners of the Sellsword Company massing below, and the sun and spear of Dorne moving up on the flank, and he did not send a raven begging for help, because there was no one left within reach to send it to. There was a bitter symmetry in it that Kevan, a practical man, allowed himself exactly one moment to feel. His whole life he had cleaned up after louder Lannisters, Tywin's wars, Cersei's schemes, Tyrion's ruin, and now he would die cleaning up after the last of them, holding a gate his family's cruelty had left indefensible. Hold the gates, he told his captains, because it was the only order left worth giving. Make them pay for every yard. It won't be enough. Do it anyway. The Golden Company came on with a discipline the city's defenders had never faced. No rabble, no green boys, but exiles who had spent their whole lives being very good at exactly this, and who had a boy at last worth being good for. They broke against the walls and reformed and broke again, patient as a tide. And for 2 days, Kevin's watchmen did the impossible and held. It was not the front gate that lost the city. It was the tunnels. Oberyn Martell had not spent those decades of patience idly. Dorne had traded with King's Landing, spied on it, mapped its underbelly of drains and dry cisterns and forgotten smugglers' ways for 2 generations, waiting for a night exactly like this one. Oberyn led the vanguard in himself, through the dark beneath the city, and it very nearly ended him there, in a flooded culvert where a knot of Kevin's men had been posted on a hunch, and the fighting was blind and drowning and hand to hand in water to the waist. Oberyn took a blade along the thigh and put his spear through 3 men in a space too tight to swing it, and came up out of the dark behind the walls, bleeding and laughing and very much alive, with the gatehouse at his back and the bar already lifting. After that it was quick. Kevin Lannister died the way his nephew Jaime had lived, with a sword in his hand at the Red Keep's inner gate, holding a doorway against men he knew he could not stop, buying with his own life the minutes it took for someone to reach Tommen and pull the boy out of the chaos alive. The child was found and taken and kept into Aegon's custody rather than a corpse in a burning hall, because whatever else this new dragon meant to be, he did not mean to start his reign the way the last one had ended. And then, through gates his own soldiers had thrown open, young Griff walked into the city as Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name. The small folk who lined the streets were old enough, some of them, to remember the last time a Targaryen banner flew over the Red Keep, the wildfire, the Mad King's screams, the Golden Lion coming through these same gates to end a dynasty. Now the black dragon rose again over the keep, where Elia Martell had died, raised there by the son she'd died protecting, not 20 years after the mountain's hands had supposedly ended his line forever. Some of them cheered, some of them only watched and remembered and said nothing. A raven left the city that same night, racing north through the first winter storms toward a king on the wall, a king who had held 2 wars in his head at once and chosen the colder one, and who was about to learn the exact price of leaving a city defended just well enough to lose. By the time the Black Wings found him, Westeros would no longer be a realm with a throne and its scattered enemies. It would be 3 armies, 3 crowns, and one long night coming down on all of them, and not one of the 3 yet willing to be the first to look away from the other 2. By the time the snows came down in earnest, a man could have drawn the new map of Westeros in 3 colors and been finished before his ink froze. The north was Stannis's, and the Riverlands, and the Stormlands. His brother's crown had left him. A long, cold spine of the continent, held together by things that did not usually hold anything together. Stark loyalty, which the North gave freely to a man who kept his word, whether it warmed to him or not. Tully gratitude, fresh and unfeigned. Riverrun restored, and remembered who had restored it. And, stranger than either, the wildlings Jon Snow had spent years bleeding to bring south of the wall, folded now into the Watch's thin lines. Free folk and crows standing the same watch, because the thing in the dark did not pause to check a man's birth before it killed him. It was not a warm coalition. Stannis Baratheon had never in his life assembled a warm anything. But it was solid the way he was solid, unlovely, unbending, and very hard to break. The south and east were another matter entirely. There the map ran red and black in 2 directions at once, because the realm had been handed not 1 returned dragon, but 2, and no living maester had a clean answer for which of them was the true one. In the vale sat Daenerys, Aerys' daughter, last child of the direct line, born in a storm the night the dynasty fell, coming home at last behind 3 dragons and an army that had never once lost a war. In King's Landing sat Aegon, Rhaegar's son, or a boy John Connington had needed his whole life to be Rhaegar's son, carried out of the sack under a butcher's child's corpse and raised for exactly this hour. Both had been told, since they were old enough to understand the words, that the throne was theirs by blood. Neither could prove the other a liar. Neither would bend the knee to the other to find out. The great houses did what great houses always do when the ground shifts under them. They recalculated, quietly, in shuttered rooms, weighing a foreign queen's dragons against a homegrown prince's convenient face, weighing old debts against new fears, and above all, weighing which of the 3 crowns was least likely to fall on them if they guessed wrong. No lord wanted to be the last man loyal to a losing claim. Every lord wanted to be exactly 1 week too late to have committed to one. It made for a strange kind of stillness, not peace. No man was fool enough to call it peace, but a held breath, 3 drawn swords, each waiting for one of the others to move first. A lord in the Stormlands could sit at his own table and name on his fingers 3 different kings, any one of whom might hang him by summer, and not know which finger to fear most. Those who had ridden through the whole War of the 5 Kings said, lo, over their cups, that this was somehow worse. In that war, a man had at least known who his enemy was. This was 3 enemies pretending to be a truce, and everyone in the realm could feel the pretending starting to wear thin. And 1,000 miles north of all of it, a man kept sending letters no one had time to read. Jon Snow's ravens came down out of the white sky, one after another, and each one said the same thing in colder words than the last. The wildling camps beyond the wall were breaking up, not scattering, fleeing, streaming toward the gates in numbers. The watch had no food to feed and no room to hold, all of them telling the same story with the same flat terror behind their eyes. The dead were walking. Villages that had stood in the haunted forest since the age of heroes were empty, their people gone south or gone worse. Whatever winter the maesters had been politely predicting for years had stopped being the season and started being an army. He wrote to King's Landing. He wrote to the Vale. He wrote to every lord whose seat could still receive a bird. They were all of them far too busy counting each other's swords to answer a boy at the top of the world, telling them the world was ending. And so, the one warning that mattered went out again and again into a realm that had decided 3 separate times over that its neighbor was the more urgent threat. In Highgarden, the roses were dead under frost, and Marjorie Tyrell walked the frozen gardens with her father and told him, in the pleasant voice she used for unpleasant truths, exactly what their loyalty had bought them. He hasn't written, she said, not once since he marched. No thanks, no lands, no match for me or Loras or anyone. We handed Stannis Baratheon the throne, father, and in return, he handed us the privilege of watching him ride away from it to fight snowmen. He's a hard man. We knew that when we chose him. Hard I could work with. Hard men can be flattered, or frightened, or bought. Marjorie stopped at a fountain skinned over with ice. Stannis can't be any of those things. He gave us justice for grandmother, and he thinks the debt is paid in full. And the worst of it is, he's right by his own lights. He owes us nothing further, and he'll give us nothing further. And he's brought that red woman's fire god south with him, crowding out the 7 the Reach has kept faith with for 1,000 years. We won a war for a king who has no use for us and no love for our gods. That is not an alliance, Father. That is a leash we tied to ourselves. He won us the war. He won the war himself and let us pay for it. She turned from the ice. Count it honestly. Grandmother is dead. Loris still can't draw a full breath from the wound he took getting me out of that city. Our levees bled on the Blackwater Road and at the walls of King's Landing. And what did the Reach get for its dead? A thank you the king was too busy to send. He rode north to fight the snow and left us holding the south for him. And if either dragon comes for Highgarden tomorrow, Father, do you imagine Stannis Baratheon turns his army around to save us? He'd write us a very correct letter of regret. Mace Tyrell had spent his whole life being led by sharper minds than his own, and he had learned at least to no one when it was speaking. He said nothing, and he listened, and that was new. The offer, when it came dressed in John Connington's careful hand. Connington had kept a boy's secret for 20 years by never once moving carelessly, and he did not move carelessly now. He wrote to Highgarden not as a supplicant, but as a man extending a rare thing, and the thing he extended was everything Stannis had withheld. A marriage. Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name, seated in the Red Keep, with a dragon's blood and a Martell's grievance behind him, to take Marjorie Tyrell to wife, and the Reach into the heart of a restored dynasty. Not a debt grudgingly settled. A crown actually offered to the woman a drunken boy king's cruelty had cheated of one already. Marjorie read it twice, and then she looked at her father, and for once neither of them needed to say the clever thing. There's a risk in it, she admitted, because she was her grandmother's granddaughter and never let herself be swept anywhere she hadn't walked first. If the boy's a fraud, we've hung the whole house on Blackfire's lie. If the Dragon Queen wins her quarrel with him, we're on the losing side of it. And Dorne already sits at his right hand. We'd be sharing his favor with Oberyn Martell, who is not a man who shares. She set the letter down. But Stannis offers us certainty, Father, and the certainty is that we're finished. No match, no growth, no place at the table. A fire god where our sept should be. A slow, respectable nothing. And the boy offers you a throne. He's offering me what Joffrey promised and never meant, she said quietly. A real crown, not a leash. Mace Tyrell weighed it the only way he knew how. His exhausted, unrewarded house against a young king who was offering it to the world. An old ally who had turned his back against a new one, holding out both hands. He weighed his mother's ghost and what she would have made of a bargain that turned her murder into a throne for her granddaughter. He did not weigh it long. House Tyrell withdrew its banners from Stannis Baratheon entirely, and pledged the full strength of the Reach, its gold, its granaries, its tens of thousands of swords, to Aegon VI Targaryen. In a single sealed letter, the alliance that had won Stannis his throne unmade the ground beneath his southern holdings, and left the northbound king more alone than he had been since the night he sailed from Dragonstone. The news climbed the mountain to the Eyrie, the way all news reached Daenerys now. Through the patient, invisible web of spies, her people had spent a year weaving across a strange continent. And it did not arrive as one clean fact, but as 100 small ones that assembled themselves over a single long night into something she could hardly breathe around. There was a boy in King's Landing calling himself Aegon, Rhaegar's son, her own brother's son, if it was true. Alive these 20 years, hidden, tutored, guarded, and delivered back into the game by the same soft, clever, fat-fingered spider who had once sat at the council of her own exile in Essos, murmuring of the realm that yearned for its rightful king, before he slipped back into the dark and left her to Drogo and the Dothraki Sea. Varys. Daenerys said the name like something she wanted to burn. He sat at my table. He spoke of my birthright, and all the while he had another dragon in his sleeve, kept warm against the day I proved inconvenient, or against the day you proved dead, Your Grace. Tyrion Lannister turned his cup slowly in the firelight, and he chose his words the way a man chooses his footing on ice. Varys doesn't love people. He loves the realm, his idea of it at least. A spare heir isn't an insult to you. It's insurance. He hedges. It's the only prayer he knows. You would counsel patience. Missandei's voice was even, but there was steel folded through it. You always counsel patience. It is good counsel for a man with nothing to lose. My queen has a claim to lose. I counsel you to know what's true before you set it on fire. Tyrion set the cup down. If the boy is genuinely Rhaegar's son, then he has a claim older than yours, and burning him makes you exactly the thing your enemies already whisper you are, the Mad King's daughter, torching her own blood for a chair. And if he's a fraud, a black fire in a dragon's cloak, then all you need to do is prove it, and half his support falls away without your dragons lifting a wing. Either way, Your Grace, the answer begins with a question, not a torch. And convenient, Missandei said. Note only how convenient he is. A nephew, appearing at the precise hour his existence does you the most harm, vouched for by a man who has lied to everyone he has ever served. The queen's instinct is not madness, it is arithmetic. Daenerys listened to both of them, because that was the discipline she had beaten into herself across a hard decade. To hear the counsel she disliked as clearly as the counsel she wanted. In the end, she split the difference, and the splitting satisfied no one, which is often the mark of a wise decision, and always the mark of a costly one. She sent envoys south, not with an offer of alliance, not with an army, but with a demand for proof. Bloodlines witnessed, testimony sworn, anything at all beyond one exiled lord's word and a face that happened to resemble old paintings of a dead prince. Aegon's court refused. Of course it refused. No king submits the fact of his own blood to a rival's judgment and remains a king afterward. Connington understood that the demand was itself a move, and answered it as one, and shut the door. His reply, when it reached the Vale, was a single stinging line, that his Grace Aegon, 6th of his name, would be glad to receive his aunt's fealty whenever she was ready to give it, and had no further comment on the matter of his birth. Daenerys read it in front of her whole council, and did not burn it, which several of them privately counted a victory. "He calls me his aunt," she said, as though the question were already settled, as though I were the pretender come late to his door. Her hand had closed on the arm of her chair. "I crossed the world for this throne, Tyrion. I have earned every league of it in blood. And now I am asked to kneel to a boy Varys pulled out of his sleeve, on his word, in the house my family built." "Then don't kneel," Tyrion said. "But don't burn either. Wait. Let Winter and his own supporters do to him what your dragons would only make him a martyr for." And so the South locked solid. 2 dragons frozen 100 miles apart, each unwilling to strike the other, and each unable to yield. A standoff so total that neither could turn its full strength against Stannis, against the winter, or against anything at all. The realm held its breath and called the paralysis peace. And the only creatures in Westeros still moving with purpose that season were the ones already dead. At Castle Black, the ravens came down through the smoke of the yard fires, and Stannis Baratheon read the ruin of everything he had built without moving a single muscle of his face. Kevan died at the Red Keep's inner gate. Tommen is a hostage in a dragon boy's keep. King's Landing lost. The city he had taken, street by street, handed away in a week to a claimant no one in the realm had known to fear. The Vale went to a second dragon and her 3 living ones. And last and worst, the Reach. Highgarden, Marjorie, the whole golden weight of the ally whose murdered grandmother had started this entire war, sworn now to his enemy, The alliance that had crowned him turned inside out and pointed at his own exposed flank. He read each report the way he read a supply ledger. He set each one down when he was done, squared to the edge of the table, in order. His officers, watching, could not have told from his face whether he had just lost a kingdom or won a wager. And that was precisely how Stannis wanted it. Because a king who lets his men watch the floor drop out from under him has already begun to fall himself. And Stannis had spent a lifetime not falling in front of anyone. Only Davos, who knew him as well as any living man, saw the small thing, the muscle working at the hinge of the jaw, the grinding of teeth that in Stannis Baratheon did the work other men gave to weeping. You could rage, Davos offered quietly when the others had gone. No one here would think less of you. You built the thing they just broke. Rage is a fire, Davos. It warms a man for an evening and leaves him colder in the morning. And it never once moved an army a single mile. Stannis did not look up from the maps. I gave that city to Kevin Lannister because he was a decent man in an indecent family, and I thought decency had earned a reward. It earned him a sword in the gut at a gate he couldn't hold. That is on my ledger, not his. I will carry it. I will not perform it. Melisandre watched him absorb it. Catastrophe stacked on catastrophe. And when the last raven was set aside, she said the thing she had been circling for months. You have given nearly everything for that crown, she said. Your brothers, your name's good standing, years of your life, and blood that was not always guilty. And I have followed you toward it, because the fire showed me a king who would stand against the dark. She let the flames throw their light up across her face. But the fire has changed its song, my king. The dark cannot be fought by a realm torn into thirds, and if your crown is the thing keeping it torn, then your crown may be the price the living have to pay to go on living. I did not think I would ever say such a thing to you. I am saying it now. Stannis said nothing. He had learned, over years of her, when a silence served him better than an argument. Then Jon Snow came in from the cold with the last piece, and it made the rest of it small. The boy's face had gone gray with more than the wind. He had been beyond the wall himself with the Rangers, and he brought back what the Rangers were whispering when they thought no officer could hear. Whites closer than any man in the Watch's memory. Not stragglers now, but a front, a tide line of the dead moving south with a patience nothing dead should have. Whole villages of the risen, children among them, which was the part the Rangers could not say aloud and could not stop seeing. And among them, sighted twice at distance, and never twice by the same man, a single figure, tall, pale, crowned in ice, leading the others the way a general leads a column, with purpose and direction and something worse than hunger. Intent. Whatever it was not driving the dead the way a storm drives snow. It was commanding them. "It's not a storm coming, Your Grace," John said quietly. "Storms don't plan. This thing is coming here, and it's bringing every corpse north of the wall with it. And it is not far." He met the king's eyes. "Whatever you're going to decide about the South, decide it tonight. We don't have the week." Stannis called no lords to the fire that night. He called 3 people. Melisandre, who had followed him toward a throne, and now watched him stand at the edge of throwing it away. Davos, who had never wanted anything from him but the chance to tell him the truth.
And Jon Snow, who commanded the only wall between the living and the thing wearing a crown of ice. He laid it out for them the way he laid out everything, stripped, plain, and without a scrap of comfort to soften it. The wall cannot hold what's coming. Not with the watch, not with my host, not with both together. It needs the realm behind it, every sword, every dragon, every granary from Dorne to the neck. And the realm will never stand behind it so long as 3 armies keep bleeding each other white over a chair that won't matter to anyone who's frozen. He looked at each of them in turn. That is the whole of it. There is no clever way out. I have been turning it for a fortnight, and there is no 4th door. Jon Snow spoke first, because he was the one who lived with the arithmetic every day. The free folk understood this before any lord did.
Mance Rayder spent his whole life getting 90 clans who hated each other to march under one banner. Not because they stopped hating each other, but because the alternative was dying apart instead of living together. He failed, and it killed him. But he was right. He looked at the king. The living have to stand as one thing, or they don't stand at all. There isn't a version of this where 3 crowns each keep what's theirs, and we all survive the winter. "Which brings us to the cost of standing as one thing," Stannis said. "There cannot be 3 crowns. There can barely be one." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Davos, because it was always Davos, asked the question the other 2 could not make themselves say. "You're circling it, Your Grace, so I'll say it plain, and you can hate me for it after. Are you willing to give up the crown? The one you've told me, and told me, and told me these 7 years is yours before gods and men?" The fire cracked. Melisandre's eyes came up sharp, because she, of all of them, had staked the most on the answer being no. "A king," Stannis said slowly, "who lets the realm die so that he can die wearing its crown, was never fit to hold it. My whole claim, every word of it, rests on the throne being a duty. Robert made it a party. Joffrey made it a whip. Eris made it a pyre. I told myself I would make it a law again, something that served the people under it." He was quiet for a moment. the law I was born to serve requires the realm to survive, and the realm's survival requires I give the chair to someone else, then keeping it would make me exactly the kind of king I spent my life despising. The crown was never the point. I think I have always known that. I only ever wanted it to be right. It was, in its cold and joyless way, the most honorable thing he had ever said, and it cost him more than the war had. He did not write to Daenerys directly. A foreign queen he had never met, a diplomatic misstep, a proud word taken wrong. The stakes were too high to trust to a stranger's reading of his blunt hand. He wrote instead, to the one person in the Vale he trusted to carry a hard message honestly, and to read a room he could not see. He wrote to Sansa Stark, Ned Stark's daughter, ward turned survivor turned kingmaker, the girl who had already unmade one schemer and won a queen her knights. He asked her to broker the single most consequential bargain of the entire war, the Iron Throne itself, freely surrendered in exchange for turning 3 dragons north before the dead reached the wall. He sealed it with the crowned stag and the fiery heart both, and he gave it to the fastest bird in Castle Black, and he watched it go south into the dark, carrying the crown he had spent his whole life insisting was his, hoping a Stark could put into a dragon queen's hand the one thing he could not afford to keep, and could not afford to have refused. Sansa Stark read the letter alone, twice, in a cold tower room high in the Eyrie, and by the second reading, her hands had gone still in the particular way they did when she was deciding how a thing could kill her. She knew Stannis Baratheon only by reputation, the joyless brother, the burning god, the man who had ground House Lannister to powder without once raising his voice. Everyone said he was rigid. Everyone said he was cold. What Sansa saw, in the plain, hard lines of his hand, was neither weakness nor a trick. She had spent years now learning to read what powerful people actually wanted underneath the words they used to hide it. And she had learned that the rarest thing in any court was a man who wanted exactly what he said he wanted. Stannis was offering the throne away because his sense of duty had always outweighed his sense of himself, and that made the offer more dangerous than any lie, because it was true. She did not go to Daenerys as a supplicant. She had earned better than that. She had handed this queen the Knights of the Vale on a plate, undone Peter Baelish with nothing but the truth, and she walked into the Dragon Queen's court carrying Stannis' letter like a woman who knew precisely what it was worth. Daenerys was not easy to convince. A king does not hand over a throne he fought a war to win, she said. She had been lied to by clever men her whole life, and the recent shock of a nephew who might not be a nephew had sharpened every instinct she owned. He wants something. Time. My dragons pointed at his enemy while he kept the north. Tell me what he wants, Lady Stark, because I have never once met a man who wanted nothing. You haven't met this one. Tyrion Lannister spoke from the side of the room, turning his cup slowly, and the whole court turned with him. Forgive me, Your Grace, but I have, by reputation and by the corpses of my entire family, everything anyone has ever said about Stannis Baratheon makes this offer not just possible, but likely. He will not compromise. He will not lie. He is so devoted to the letter of the law that he condemned his own allies by it. A man like that, told the realm cannot survive divided, does not scheme. He does the sum, and then he does the hard thing the sum requires, and he hates every moment of it. He drank. It's the most Stannis thing I've ever heard, and I never even liked him. Daenerys was quite a long moment, weighing the counsel she disliked against the counsel she wanted, which was the discipline that had kept her alive. And if I take his throne, she said slowly, and turn my dragons north as he asks, and spend them on a war of dead men in the snow, what does he imagine I'll be left to rule when it's done? Ashes and ice? He imagines you'll rule something, Your Grace. Sansa did not lower her eyes, and the Queen marked it. Which is more than any of you will rule if the wall comes down. I've read the same reports he has. I have a brother out there in it somewhere. Stannis Baratheon isn't offering you a gift. He's offering you the chance to inherit a kingdom instead of a graveyard. And he's paying for it with the only thing he ever wanted. If you take that for weakness, you've never met a man who meant a thing he said. The court had gone very still. Few people spoke to the Queen that way, and stayed in the room afterward. Then I accept, Daenerys said at last, but on my terms, not his. Her terms were not small, not merely an alliance against the boy in King's Landing, but the full and public acceptance of her claim. Stannis Baratheon on his knees before the realm, renouncing the throne in his own voice, naming her the rightful Targaryen queen. And in exchange, her word, dragon's word, that once the Pretenders' coalition was broken, her dragons would indeed turn north. Before winter finished the work, the living had been too busy to stop. She had them written into a single letter, sealed with black wax and a 3-headed dragon. Sansa Stark took it and understood, as the wax cooled in her palm, that she now carried the fate of 2 kingdoms and a crown through a continent full of men who would kill her for far less. The single most important courier in the history of Westeros, with 1,000 miles of hostile ground between her and the man waiting on the wall for her answer. Word outran the courier, as word always does. It reached the wall in whispers and half-truths, days before Sansa's sealed letter could. The king means to give it away, the throne, the whole of it, to the foreign woman with the dragons. And by the time it reached Stannis' own tent, the men who had bled 7 years for his claim were looking at each other and wondering what exactly they had bled for. Davos Seaworth was not among the doubters. For the first time in the whole long war, he found he had nothing to argue against. "I've spent years telling you when you were wrong, Your Grace," he said. "Renly, the leeches, the boy you'd have burned on a beach if I hadn't taken him off it. I've been the one voice in the room that said no more times than I can count." He shook his head slowly. "And now you've gone and done the one thing I never dared hope you would. And I don't have a single word of caution in me. A king who gave up his crown to save the people under it. That's the king I always prayed was in there somewhere. It cost you everything to be him. I'm sorry it did. I'm glad you are." Melisandre found it harder. She had followed the flames to this man for years, certain her god had shown her Azor Ahai reborn with a crown of fire. Stannis at the center of the war against the dark. Stannis on the Iron Throne. Stannis, the sword in the night. A future in which he handed that throne to another and knelt was not a future the fire had ever shown her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not know whether her lord's plan and this man's choices were still the same road. "Perhaps I read the flames wrong," she admitted, which she had almost never said aloud. "Or perhaps the crown was never the shape of your part in it. I no longer know, my king." "That is a strange and frightening thing for me to say. You told me once I was the prince who was promised." Stannis did not soften it. "You told me the throne and the war were the same road. If they were not, if I've spent 7 years and a great many lives climbing toward a chair I was always meant to give away, then say so plainly, and we'll both live with it. I don't know if they were on the same road. I only know the flames still show me you in the cold, at the end of it, with a sword." She was quiet. "Not a crown, a sword. Perhaps that was always the part that mattered, and I dressed it in gold because gold was what you wanted to hear." "I never wanted gold," Stannis said. "I wanted to be right. It appears the fire and I finally agree on how little those two things have in common. It was Jon Snow who cut the cleanest to the bone. He had spent years training himself not to think about Southern thrones at all, and he said so." "From where I stand, at the actual edge of the actual war," Jon told him, "none of it means anything Not the claims, not the crowns, not the names men give themselves. If the wall falls while the South is still arguing about who deserves to sit a chair, then the chair burns with everyone in the room, and the argument was the most expensive thing in history. He met the king's eyes. "Tell me I'm wrong." "You're not wrong," Stannis said. "That is precisely why I'm giving it away." "Then give it fast." There was no insolence in it, only exhaustion. "I've buried men who came back wrong. I've seen the thing that's driving them. Every day you spend making the South kneel is a day I can't get back up here." John paused. "I'm not asking you to hurry for me. I'm asking you to hurry for the 20,000 people freezing behind these gates who have never heard the name Targaryen and won't care whose banner flies over them if they're dead." Stannis looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between the grim king and the grim boy that neither would ever have called respect, though that is what it was. He left Jon Snow in command of the wall, dragon glass in every armory, disciplined companies on every mile, every scrap of preparation 5 years of warning could buy, stacked against the dark. And then Stannis Baratheon turned his hardened host south one final time, not to take a throne, but to end the war, keeping a realm too divided to save itself, riding hard against a winter that had already begun spilling white over the mountains at his back. In King's Landing, the news landed on John Connington like a stone through a roof. He had built his whole ruined life around one boy and one impossible hope. And he had been winning. The Reach sworn, Dorne beside them, the capital taken, the Dragon Queen frozen in her mountain by a quarrel over blood. And now the two enemies who should have destroyed each other had done the one thing he had counted on their pride to prevent. They had joined. A Baratheon legalist and a Targaryen queen, bound by nothing but shared enemies and a promise neither of them fully trusted. And it did not matter in the least that the alliance was cold. Cold steel still cuts. The young man they called Aegon took it worse than his guardian. He had been raised his whole life on the certainty of the thing, tutored and drilled and told every single day that a throne and a destiny were waiting. And now two enemies who were supposed to devour each other had turned as one toward him. "They're two claims, and one of them's a foreigner who's never set foot here," the boy said. The realm is mine, my father's, my grandfather's. They'll see that. They'll see 3 dragons and 40,000 swords, your grace, Connington said, gentler with him than with anyone else alive, and harder than the boy wanted. A true claim is a fine thing. I have staked my whole life on yours. But a true claim does not stop dragonfire, and it does not stop a disciplined host with a grudge. And against both at once, it stops precisely nothing. He put his scarred finger on the map, on the vast black sprawl of a ruined castle beside the God's Eye. So we don't meet them in an open field and let dragons pick us apart. We put stones between us and the sky. We make them come to Harrenhal, and we make the coming cost them everything. Not everyone had their heart in the walls. Oberyn Martell stood apart from the war council and felt for the first time in a life built entirely around a single, patient fury, the ground shifting beneath the thing he had given everything for. He had fought his whole existence toward this. Elia's son on the throne. The Martell wound finally closed. The family that let his sister die made him kneel to her blood. And now the enemy at the gates was not a Lannister. There were no Lannisters left. The enemy was another Targaryen entirely, and a Baratheon who had already sent him the mountain's head as a gift. And Dorne's decades of vengeance were about to end not in a triumph, but as a footnote, a small red line in the chronicle of a war between kings and queens who had never once been his enemies. A younger spearman asked him, half joking, whether they oughtn't slip away south while the roads were open. Let the dragons and the stag settle it, and keep Dorne's spears for Dorne, and go home to Duran and tell him we ran? Oberyn's smile did not reach his eyes. My brother waited 50 years for this. My sister waited longer in her grave. No, we don't get to be careful now. Careful is what got Elia killed while the realm looked away. He looked out at the gathering horizon. We chose a side. The side may be about to lose. That is the trouble with revenge. It makes you forget to ask whether you can win before you've already sworn to die for it.
But I'd sooner die on the right side of an old wound than live on the wrong one. Wouldn't you? The young man had no answer. Oberyn clapped his shoulder and left him to find one. Then the horizon began to fill. At Harrenhal, the largest castle ever raised in Westeros, half melted 300 years before by the first dragon to ever fly over the field, the very place Aegon the Conqueror had broken the last king to stand against him. 3 armies that were never meant to share a war converged at last. Stannis' grim northern host came up from one road. Daenerys' unsullied and screaming Dothraki came up the other, and above them, wheeling slowly and enormous against a sky the color of old iron, 3 living dragons. And behind the great scarred walls that 3 centuries of siegecraft had never learned to crack, the Golden Company and the Spears of Dorne dug in and waited and watched the sky come from.
The battle opened the way Connington had feared and prepared for, all at once, from above. Stannis had wanted to try the walls first, the old way, with rams and towers and the patience of a proper siege. He distrusted anything that won too easily, and he distrusted the dragons most of all. Daenerys overruled him without much ceremony. She had not crossed the world to spend a month starving out a castle while winter closed the roads behind her. She did not waste men on the walls. She sent fire over them. The dragons came in low and terribly out of the iron sky, and where 300 years of siege engineering had taught Harrenhal's builders to fear rams and towers and tunnels, none of it had ever once accounted for death that simply flew over the battlements and fell. Carefully prepared killing grounds became killing grounds for the men who had prepared them. The Golden Company's discipline, the thing exiles had spent generations perfecting, began within the first hour to do something no mercenary contract had ever asked it to: survive. And then, for one long and awful stretch of the morning, it looked as though it might not be enough.
Connington had not spent those decades idle either. The old walls bristled with scorpions, great bolt throwers the sellswords had hauled across the narrow sea and seated behind the merlons, aimed not at men, but at the sky. The first volleys missed. The second did not. A bolt the length of a spear took Viserion through the wing, and then two more found him, and the cream and gold dragon that had crossed the whole world at his mother's side came down out of the smoke screaming in a way that stopped the fighting on both sides of the wall, and struck the earth, and did not rise. For that moment, the dragons were not invincible. Every man on both sides saw it. On the walls the Golden Company roared, and for one heartbeat the whole shape of the day hung open, and the wrong ending stood in the doorway. Daenerys did not break. Grief made her precise. Drogon and Rhaegal came back around wide of the Scorpion's arc, low along the ground where the bolts could not track them, and they burned the engines and the men who worked them out of existence. And after that, there was no more fire from the walls, only fire onto them. Connington, watching his defenses turn to slag and his companies come apart, understood before anyone else on that wall that the battle was already lost. Oberyn Martell understood it too, and refused it. He would not flee a war he had helped begin. He gathered the Dornishmen, and what of the Golden Company would still follow a doomed banner, and he led them out through a sallyport and straight into the flank of Stannis' advancing infantry with all the reckless, spectacular fury that had defined his whole gaudy life. It nearly worked.
For a few red minutes, his charge folded Stannis' line back on itself, and the spears drove deep, and men who had marched 1,000 miles for a joyless king died in the mud of the god's eye. A dozen of Stannis' best among them, cut down by a prince who fought like something out of a song. He came within 30 feet of the king's own standard. He did not reach it. A wall of northern shields closed over the breach, and the tide that had briefly run backward ran forward again, and Oberyn Martell died the only way he had ever truly been going to. Not old, not abed, but in the middle of a fight for a cause he actually believed in, laughing, taking better men down with him into the dark. By dusk, the great walls were breached, the Golden Company broken, the Dornish spears scattered. John Connington fell at the last, defending an inner gate, cut down, still trying to put his own body between the world and a boy he had guarded since childhood. And the boy, Aegon, whoever he had truly been, was taken alive out of the ruin. They brought him in chains across a field still burning, and set him down between the two monarchs whose alliance had ended him, and Stannis Baratheon and Daenerys Targaryen looked at the captive claimant and at each other, and understood that they now had to decide together what to do with a Targaryen neither of them could afford to let live, and neither of them wished to be the one to kill. They decided it the way hard rulers decide such things, quietly, between the two of them, in a tent that smelled of smoke, and neither of them ever spoke of it again. Whatever Aegon had been, Rhaegar's true son or Varys's beautiful lie, there was no room in a realm with one throne for a boy other men would keep raising banners over.
His fate was settled without ceremony. It was the first act of a co-regency, and it was the kind of act that co-regencies are quietly built on. Stannis kept his word. That was the whole of him in the end. Before the assembled lords of both their battered hosts, on a field still black from dragonfire, Stannis Baratheon knelt and renounced the Iron Throne in his own flat, carrying voice, and named Daenerys Targaryen the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms. It should have looked like defeat. Somehow, from a man who had wanted the crown to be a duty and not a prize, it looked like the only thing he had ever actually won. Daenerys had watched this whole war, and she had understood something about it that her advisors had not. That the thing which had held the realm together long enough to fight over was not her dragons or her blood, but the cold, unlovely iron of the man now kneeling in the ash. She did not want him as a subject. She named him something closer to a partner. Hand of the Queen and Warden of the North both. An uneasy, joyless, militaristic sharing of power that neither of them trusted and both of them recognized as the only arrangement that might actually work. Fire on the throne, steel at its side. "You could have kept fighting," she told him after in the smoke-stained tent. "You had the North. You had walls of your own. Men have burned realms for less than a crown, and you handed me one you already wore."
Men who burn realms for crowns were never fit to wear them. Stannis did not look at her like a subject looks at a queen. He looked at her the way one commander sizes up another he intends to keep alive. "I did not give you the throne because I trust you, Your Grace. I don't. I gave it to you because the alternative was watching everything freeze while we argued about whose it was. Rule well, and I'll have no cause to regret it. Rule badly, and you'll find I make a very poor hand." It was, from Stannis Baratheon, almost warmth. Daenerys, who had been threatened by better and cleverer men, found she believed every word and was strangely comforted by it. And then, as promised, she turned her strength north. She gave the order the morning after the field was won. Her surviving dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, and the bulk of the unsullied legions, to begin the long march to the wall, to honor the pact that had ended the war between fire and steel. It was the first great collective act of a newly united realm, and it was the right one, and it came as fast as any such thing could be made to come. But armies move at the speed of the world, and even dragons must be fed, and the days it took to organize the march, to gather the columns, to resupply a host that had just bled itself pale at Harrenhal, those were days. And the days were the one thing that had run out. At the wall, Jon Snow stood on the ice in a wind that had stopped being weather, and watched the horizon go white. They came in the numbers the free folk had promised, and no southern lord had believed. The dead, a tide of them, more than dragonglass and disciplined companies, and 5 years of desperate preparation were ever going to hold with the men he had. Behind them, patient, unhurried, came the tall, pale thing, crowned in ice, that led them the way a general leads. The reinforcements Stannis had sworn were real and coming, and days away. Winter had waited for no one's politics, made no allowance for how nearly the living had gotten it right. The ice began to crack. The great wall that had stood 8,000 years groaned under a cold older than every war Westeros had just finished fighting. And Jon Snow drew his sword and understood, with a clarity that no throne and no crown and no clever southern bargain could touch, the whole terrible shape of it at last. The peace the South had paid everything to build, the crown given away, the dragon dead, the prince in his unmarked grave, the two enemies finally, impossibly made one, had arrived exactly as promised. It had arrived for the only war that had ever actually mattered. One marching column and one dragon queen, too late. Enemies finally, impossibly made one, had arrived exactly as promised. It had arrived for the only war that had ever actually mattered. One marching column and one dragon queen, too late.